The canyon swallowed them whole. That was the only way Esther Carver could describe it when she saw the rope dangling over the edge of Redrock Narrows, frayed and swinging in the desert wind like the last prayer of a desperate man. Her heart seized in her chest, not from fear, not exactly, but from something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Because the rope belonged to United States Marshal Theodore Morgan and the blood smeared across the sandstone ledge told a story she was not prepared to read. She pressed her palm flat against the warm rock face, scanning the canyon floor 40 feet below. Nothing. No body. No horse. No badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. He was alive. He had to be alive. But alive and lost in Redrock Canyon were two entirely different things, and every living soul in Cimarron County, New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1882, knew what got lost in Redrock Canyon stayed lost forever. The canyon was not simply deep. It was deceptive, a labyrinth of branching passages and false floors and hidden overhangs that swallowed light and sound with equal hunger. Cartographers had tried and failed for 30 years to map it accurately. The Jicarilla Apache had names for every passage, names that described what the passage did to you rather than where it went, which said everything you needed to know. There was the throat that laughs, the blind man's garden, the place where the echo answers with lies. White settlers who stumbled into Redrock looking for a shortcut to Santa Fe were still finding their bleached bones there 2 decades later. But Esther Carver was not a settler who stumbled. She was the woman who had spent the last 7 years learning every secret the canyon held. She untied her own rope from the saddle horn of her dun mare, looped it around the iron-hard root of a juniper that had grown sideways out of the canyon rim, and without a single moment of hesitation, she went over the edge. The world tilted. The warm, iron-smelling air of the canyon rose up around her like a breath, and her boots found purchase on the red and ochre rock as she rappelled down in smooth, controlled movements, her leather gloves protecting her hands from the rough hemp. The canyon wall whispered past her in layers of time, rust and cream and deep burgundy, striped like the pages of a geologic history she had read with her fingertips more times than she could count. She landed lightly on a ledge 15 feet above the canyon floor, a ledge that was invisible from above, a ledge that most people would not have known to aim for. From here, she could see the continuation of the path she needed. Not a path in any visible sense. No worn trail, no cairns, no blazed trees. But to Esther, the rock itself spoke in angles and shadows, in the way certain surfaces held moisture and certain surfaces did not, in the way the air moved differently through a passage that opened up ahead versus one that dead-ended in a wall. She had been reading this canyon since she was 19 years old. She was 26 now. And somewhere below her, lost in the dark arteries of this magnificent and merciless place, was the most infuriating, compelling, and dangerously handsome man she had ever refused to fall in love with. She had about 3 hours of good light left. She started moving. To understand how a United States Marshal ended up lost at the bottom of Redrock Canyon, and how Esther Carver ended up the only person alive who could find him, you had to go back 9 days. To the afternoon, a stranger rode into the town of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, trailing dust and trouble in equal measure. Esther had been in the middle of an argument when Theodore Morgan arrived. Not an unusual state for her, as her employer, Benjamin Carver, her father's older brother and the man who had raised her after her parents died of cholera when she was 11, frequently noted with the long-suffering sigh of a man who loved his niece but sometimes wished she would simply agree with him occasionally for the sake of his digestion. The argument on this particular afternoon concerned the eastern boundary survey of the Carver Ranch, 3,000 acres of the most productive grazing land in Colfax County, and a set of survey stakes that Esther was absolutely certain had been moved overnight by persons in the employ of a man named Harlan Doss, who operated out of Springer, and who had been systematically attempting to consume the smaller ranches around him like a slow and patient fire consuming dry grass. Esther had the original survey notes spread across her uncle's kitchen table. She had a compass. She had the elevation readings she had taken herself 3 mornings ago, before dawn, while everyone else was still asleep, because that was when the air was calm and the instrument readings were most accurate. She was pointing at 3 different columns of figures and explaining, in the clipped and precise language she used when she was trying very hard not to shout, that the stakes had been moved not randomly, but in a very specific pattern that shifted the boundary line in a way that would give Das access to the creek that fed the southern pasture. Her uncle was looking at the figures and nodding slowly, which was Benjamin Carver's way of saying that he understood but was not yet convinced, which was his perpetual state when confronted with any idea more complicated than whether to brand the cattle on Tuesday or Wednesday. Hank Delaney, the foreman, was looking out the window. Esther knew Hank was looking out the window because she had been aware for some time that Hank Delaney was not entirely trustworthy, although she had not yet accumulated sufficient proof to say this to her uncle's face without it sounding like the accusations of a young woman with an overactive imagination, which was how most of her observations were categorized by most of the men in Cimarron County, to her considerable and ongoing frustration. It was at this moment, with her finger pressed against the survey notes and her patience wearing thin as creek water in August, that the sound of a horse arriving in the yard drifted through the open kitchen window, followed shortly by a voice that was deep and unhurried, and carried the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to being listened to. "Looking for Benjamin Carver," the voice said. "Got a letter of introduction from the Federal District Office in Santa Fe." Her uncle looked up. His eyebrows lifted in a way that suggested interest and relief in equal measure, the expression of a man who had been quietly hoping for exactly this kind of official attention. Esther folded her survey notes. She followed her uncle outside. Theodore Morgan was 32 years old, and he had the kind of face that the frontier produced in certain men, weather-carved and deliberate, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than from laughter, though there was something in the set of his mouth that suggested laughter was not entirely foreign to him. He was broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than from being simply large by birth, and he wore his badge not pinned to the outside of his vest, but tucked just inside it, which Esther noted immediately as the habit of a man who preferred to assess a situation before announcing himself. He saw her uncle first and dismounted, extending a hand and presenting his papers from the saddle bag with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this kind of introduction many times. He saw Esther second. He did what most men did, which was to look once, then look away, then look back again with the slightly recalibrated expression of a man who had expected one thing and found another. Esther was used to this. She was not pretty in the decorative sense, though she was not plain either. She was the kind of woman who looked like she was built for something specific, lean and direct, and with eyes the color of creek water over pale stone, and the thing she was built for was clearly not sitting still and being looked at. She did not offer her hand. She waited. Her uncle introduced her as his niece and ranch hand, and then, with the thoughtless dismissal of a man who loved her but did not fully see her, turned his full attention to the Marshal and the business of the letter. Esther went back inside and picked up her survey notes. Over the next 4 days, she and Theodore Morgan did not speak directly more than 6 times. This was not, on Esther's part, an accident. She was aware of him in the particular way. She was aware of things that required careful watching. She watched him the way she watched the canyon, reading him in angles and shadows, in what he chose to say and what he chose not to say, in where he looked when he thought no one was looking at him. He was here because of the land grab. That much was clear from the letter. A federal inquiry had been opened into the disappearance of several homesteaders in the territory, homesteaders who had filed land claims that happened to overlap with the expansion ambitions of 3 large ranch operations in the county, one of which was Harlan Doss's outfit. The marshal had been sent to investigate, quietly, before anything official was announced. He was good at his job. She could see that. He asked the right questions and he listened to the answers with his whole attention, and he did not telegraph what he thought with his face, which was the mark of a man who had learned patience the hard way. What he could not do, she observed, was navigate Redrock Canyon. This became relevant on the afternoon of the 5th day, when Esther, riding the eastern fence line to check on the boundary stakes again, spotted 2 of Doss's riders heading toward the canyon with a pack horse loaded with what looked, at a distance of half a mile through her uncle's field glasses, like survey equipment. She did not go back to the ranch house. Going back to the ranch house would cost her an hour, and by the time she returned the riders would be inside the canyon and invisible. She went forward instead, keeping to the scrub oak line, closing the distance. What she found when she reached the canyon rim was not simply 2 riders with survey equipment. It was Theodore Morgan, on foot, his horse grazing 30 yards back, watching the same 2 riders from his own vantage point. He had gotten there some other way, and he was crouched behind a boulder with his Winchester across his knees, and the particular focused stillness of a man watching something he had been waiting to see. She tied her horse quietly and came up beside him. He startled, not dramatically, not with any loss of composure, but she caught the infinitesimal shift in his shoulders, the fraction of a second where his hand moved toward his sidearm before his brain caught up with his eyes. "You move quietly," he said, not looking away from the riders below. "I have been moving quietly around this land since I was 11 years old," she said. He glanced at her, then back at the canyon. "They're going in," he said, "going to follow them." "You'll die," she said. He turned to look at her fully then. The expression on his face was the one she had expected, polite skepticism wrapped in something harder, the face of a man who did not love being contradicted, especially by a woman he did not yet have any reason to take seriously. "I have tracked men through worse country than this," he said. "Not this country," she said. "There are 3 branching passages in the first half-mile. The left-hand passage looks like the main route. It dead ends in a chimney drop of 60 feet. The center passage floods without warning when rain falls on the mesa above, even when the sky above the canyon is clear. The right-hand passage looks impassable, but it isn't. There's a hidden shelf 6 feet up the eastern wall. If you don't know it's there, you'll turn back and miss it." He was quiet for a moment. Below them, Doss's riders disappeared into the canyon mouth. "You've been in there," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I mapped it," she said. 2.5 years of mapping. Every passage, every water source, every dead end and hidden path and false floor. I know where every echo comes from and what it means. I know which rocks you can trust your weight to and which ones will shift. I know it in daylight and in moonlight and in pitch dark by sense memory alone." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Why?" he said. It was a better question than most men would have asked. Most men would have asked how, or would have simply not believed her. Why was more interesting? "Because knowledge of a place is the same as power over it," she said, "and there are people who depend on this ranch. The canyon is the eastern boundary of everything we have. I needed to know it the way a soldier needs to know the walls of the fort he's defending." Something shifted in his expression then. Not much, but she caught it. "You'll need to come with me," he said. "I know," she said. They went together. The next 2 hours were among the most charged of Esther's life, and not because of Doss's riders. Though following 2 armed men through a narrow canyon while remaining undetected required a quality of attention that left no room for anything careless. It was charged in the way that proximity to something compelling and slightly dangerous always was, and Theodore Morgan was, she was discovering, both of those things simultaneously. She led. This was not a negotiation. She simply moved to the front and he followed, and to his considerable credit, he did not attempt to reassert any kind of precedence. He watched her hands, watched her feet, read her pauses as the signals they were, and stopped when she stopped and moved when she moved. He was a fast learner, and he was quiet, genuinely quiet, not just trying to be quiet but constitutionally capable of it, which she had not expected. They tracked the riders to a chamber deep in the canyon's middle section, a natural amphitheater with good acoustics that Esther had always privately thought of as the council room, where the echoes behaved in such a way that you could hear a conversation happening on the far side of the space, with startling clarity from the shadow of the entrance. What they heard stopped them both. Das's riders were meeting someone, a third man already there, already waiting, not a surveyor. The equipment on the pack horse was a cover. What changed hands in the council room was not survey equipment. It was paper, documents. And the conversation was brief and specific, the kind of conversation that people have when they have already made their plan and are only confirming the final details. The final detail, as Esther and Theodore stood motionless in the shadow of the entrance and listened to the acoustics carry every word with crystalline clarity across the amphitheater, was the name of a man, a land office official in Cimarron. A man named Reeve Cullen, who had been quietly altering the recorded boundaries on homestead claims for 2 years, changing numbers in ink that looked identical to the original ink but wasn't, backdating documents in a hand that matched the original surveyor's but wasn't, creating a paper trail that would hold up in any court that didn't know to look for what Esther had already found in the field. She looked at Theodore Morgan in the dark. He looked at her. His eyes said, "You knew about this." Hers said, "I suspected, now I'm certain." They retreated the way they had come, and when they emerged from the canyon mouth into the long amber light of the late afternoon, the first thing Theodore did was turn to her and say, with the deliberate directness of a man rearranging his understanding of a situation, "Tell me everything you know, from the beginning. Leave nothing out." It was the first time anyone had said that to her and meant it. She told him. They sat on a flat red rock above the canyon rim, with the sun going down behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in colors so extravagant they seemed almost embarrassing. And Esther Carver laid out 3 months of careful observation, the moved survey stakes, and the ink discrepancies she had found on the copies she had been allowed to examine at the land office. The pattern of Das's riders always moving at dawn and dusk, when visibility was poor. The way certain fences on neighboring properties had shifted in ways that no one had officially complained about yet, because complaining officially required going to the same land office that was falsifying the records. Theodore Morgan listened with his entire attention in a way that made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, that what she was saying was landing somewhere rather than simply evaporating into the air the way things she said tended to do in rooms full of men who had already decided what they thought. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You should have gone to Santa Fe yourself," he said. "Months ago." "I tried," she said. "The territorial judge sent a letter back addressed to my uncle." The letter said the judge was happy to hear Mr. Carver's concerns and invited him to present the evidence in person. She paused. "My uncle doesn't travel." The muscle in Theodore's jaw shifted. "The evidence you have is good," he said. "Better than good, but it needs one more thing, the physical documents, not just the copies, the originals from the land office vault." "I know where the vault is," she said, "and I know the combination." At his sharp look she added with a calm that she did not entirely feel, "Cullen's wife does my aunt's hair. Cullen talks in his sleep. His wife mentioned it once. I remembered." Theodore Morgan stared at her. Then slowly, something happened to his face that she had not seen there before. It was not the polite recalibration of a man encountering something unexpected. It was the full, genuine, slightly undone expression of a person who has just discovered something that exceeds the boundaries of what they thought was possible. He laughed. It was a short laugh, startled and real, and it changed his face entirely. "Miss Carver," he said, and the way he said it was different from every previous time he had used her name, which was not many times but which she had catalogued with the same precision she applied to everything. I think you may be the most dangerously capable person I have ever met in my life." She felt the warmth of it move through her like creek water in June, which was absurd and inconvenient, and exactly the kind of thing she had been very carefully not feeling for 5 days. "Marshal Morgan," she said, keeping her voice level, "I think you are about 4 days late to that observation." He looked at her. She looked away at the darkening canyon below them. And the warmth remained, stubborn and entirely inconvenient, settling somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum where it had no business being. The plan they made that evening was clean in outline and complicated in execution, the way all plans in dangerous country tended to be. Theodore would ride into Cimarron the following morning and request a formal meeting with Cullen at the land office, citing a routine inquiry into boundary documentation for the federal investigation. This would occupy Cullen for most of the morning. While Cullen was occupied, Esther would access the land office records room, which had a second entrance through the alley behind the hardware store that Cullen did not know was still accessible, because the lock on it had been broken for 8 months, and the new lock that the town council had ordered had still not arrived, a fact Esther knew because she was on the town council's correspondence list by virtue of being the person who actually read her uncle's mail. The plan had 5 clear steps. What it did not have, what no plan made in the clear logic of evening light ever seemed to account for, was Hank Delaney. Esther had been watching Hank Delaney for months. She had not told her uncle because her uncle trusted Hank with the kind of deep, unexamined faith that men placed in other men who had ridden with them for 12 years. A faith that was not susceptible to the observations of a niece who had only been managing the ranch's books and boundary surveys and daily operations for the past 7 years. She had not told Theodore because when you suspected the foreman of a ranch of being in the pocket of the man you were investigating, you held that card until you knew when to play it. She had not anticipated that Hank would move first. He did it quietly and in the dark, which was consistent with what she knew of him. He went through her things while she was asleep, which she knew because she had placed the survey notes in the left-hand drawer of her writing table, with the corner of the bottom page aligned with a pencil mark she had made on the inside of the drawer, and in the morning the alignment was off by ½ an inch. She sat with that ½ inch for a moment. Then she got up, dressed in the gray pre-dawn light, checked the position of her navy Colt in its holster, and went to find Theodore Morgan before Hank Delaney could get to him. She was not quite fast enough. She found Theodore at the livery stable, already saddling his bay horse, and the set of his shoulders told her immediately that something had changed overnight. "Hank Delaney came to see me at 2 in the morning," he said, without looking up from the cinch. "He said you've been building a case against the wrong people. Said you have a personal grudge against Das because he declined to purchase this ranch 3 years ago, and your uncle is too sentimental to see that your accounting has been running the operation into the ground." Esther was very still for a moment. "And," she said, "and he had documents." Theodore did look up then, and his eyes were complicated, holding multiple things at once with the controlled equilibrium of a man who was genuinely uncertain and was not going to pretend otherwise. "Survey notes in your handwriting or something very close to it." "How close?" she said. "Close enough to make me look at you differently for about 10 minutes, he said, until I remembered which way the ink lay. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "You write with your right hand," he said. "When you write quickly, which you do, the ink feathers slightly to the right on the down strokes. It's a pressure habit. Whoever copied your handwriting wrote it with their left hand and didn't know to account for that." She stared at him. He went back to the cinch. "I was a school teacher before I was a marshal," he said conversationally. 7 years in Missouri. You learn handwriting." Esther let out a slow breath. Then she said, "We need to move today, not tomorrow, today." He looked at her. "Agreed." They rode into Cimarron before 6 in the morning, before the dust of the main street had been stirred by anything heavier than a dog's footfall. The plan contracted to its essentials. Theodore went to wake Cullen with the official summons, and Esther went around the back of the hardware store. The lock on the alley door was still broken. She was inside the land office records room in 4 minutes. The vault combination, which Cullen's wife had mentioned to her aunt's hairdresser, and which Esther had filed away with the automatic precision of a mind that cataloged useful information the way other people collected it accidentally, worked on the third attempt. The original documents were exactly where the logic of the situation said they would be, in the bottommost locked drawer of the secondary cabinet, separated from the official files and wrapped in brown paper as though they were correspondence rather than falsified legal records. She had them out and was copying the relevant entries into her own notebook by the light coming through the alley side window when she heard the front door of the land office open. Not Theodore's voice, Hank Delaney's voice, and with it, Harlan Doss's voice. They had not come to the land office to meet with Cullen. They had come because Hank had told them what was happening and they were here to make sure it did not happen. There were 3 of them, counting Cullen, who Esther could hear scrambling out from behind his desk, with the panicked rustling of a man who had been comfortably corrupt for 2 years, and had not accounted for the moment when it stopped being comfortable. Esther put the originals back in the vault. She kept her copies. She closed the vault door and restored the combination and was back through the alley entrance before the door between the front office and the records room opened. She pressed herself flat against the outside wall. Her heart was going at a rate she did not care for, and she made herself breathe through it with the same deliberate control she used when repelling a canyon face, the same steady in-and-out rhythm that told her nervous system that she was not, in fact, dying. She was simply in a situation that required precision and would resolve if she remained precise. She went around to the front. Theodore was at the entrance of the land office, and he was not alone. The town's deputy, a young man named Ortega, who was probably the most honest person in Cimarron and who Esther had quietly been hoping would find a reason to be in the vicinity this morning, was with him. So was her uncle, Benjamin Carver, looking rumpled and alarmed and more awake than she had seen him at that hour in years. She came around the corner and Theodore's eyes found her immediately, and she saw the entire question. "Are you all right? Are they there? Do you have it?" asked and answered in the space of half a second between one glance and the next. She patted the front of her jacket pocket, where the notebook was. He looked at Deputy Ortega and said, "Now." What followed was not dramatic in the way that confrontations in Cimarron County tended to be dramatic, meaning it did not involve gunfire, which Esther was honestly relieved about, because the one time she had been in close proximity to gunfire she had found it considerably less romantic than the dime novels made it sound and considerably more terrifying. It was dramatic in the legal sense, which was its own kind of theater. Doss tried to leave through the back and found the door he expected to be unlocked was not, because Esther had locked it from the outside on her way past, which was not something he knew she had done. Cullen produced a set of documents that he claimed proved the land office records were accurate, and which Theodore examined for approximately 90 seconds before pointing out, with the calm precision of a former schoolteacher who had spent 2 years studying frontier land fraud cases, 7 specific discrepancies between those documents and the originals that Esther had copied. Esther's copies, produced from her notebook and cross-referenced against her field survey notes, which she had with her because she kept them with her always, which several people in the room had heard her say was obsessive behavior, and which now turned out to be the cornerstone of the entire case, created a record that Cullen's manufactured evidence could not explain away. Hank Delaney, who had not survived 12 years as a frontier foreman by being stupid, looked at Esther once, looked at the deputy, looked at the documents, and made the calculation that a man makes when he realizes the game has closed around him. He sat down in a chair and said nothing for a long time. It was the silence of a man deciding what he was willing to trade for leniency. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Cullen had given a statement. By 4, the federal paperwork was in motion. The homestead claims that had been corrupted would need to go through a review process that would take months, but the review would happen under a federal overseer rather than through the compromised local office, and the likelihood of the families who had been displaced getting their land back was now considerably higher than it had been 48 hours ago. Esther's uncle stood in the street outside the land office and looked at his niece with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not pride exactly. It was closer to seeing someone for the first time after a long period of looking at them so regularly that you had stopped actually seeing them. "You knew," he said, not accusatory, just recognizing it. "For a while," she said. He nodded slowly. "You should have told me," he said. "You would have asked Hank about it," she said gently. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I would have." That evening, the ranch house was full of the particular exhausted quiet of people who have been operating at the edge of their capacity all day and have now released it. Benjamin Carver had gone to bed early. Deputy Ortega had ridden back to town with the prisoners. The cook had left supper on the stove and gone home. Esther sat on the back porch with a tin cup of coffee, watching the last light fade out of the sky above the canyon rim. The canyon was dark and deep and present the way it always was in the evening, a permanent feature of the edge of her world, simultaneously the most dangerous and the most beloved landscape she knew. Theodore Morgan came and sat beside her. Not close, appropriate distance, but close enough that she was aware of his warmth in the cooling evening air. They sat in silence for several minutes. "You could take the copies you made to Santa Fe yourself," he said eventually. "As documentation, you don't need to route it through your uncle." "I know," she said. "The Federal Land Commissioner's office would see you," he said, "with what you have." "I know," she said again. "I'm going to." He was quiet. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "When this is resolved." "There's another assignment," he said. "There always is." She nodded. This was consistent with what she had understood about his life. A life that moved from one territory to the next, carried by the federal warrant, never in any one place long enough to accumulate anything heavier than a saddle bag. "I'm trying to decide," he said slowly, as though he were feeling his way through the words the way you felt your way through a dark passage with your hands on the walls, "whether I want to keep living that way." She looked at him. He was looking at the canyon. "That's an unusual thing for a man in your position to say," she said. "It's been an unusual week," he said. She looked back at the canyon. The silence between them was the kind that had weight and direction, the kind that was leading somewhere and both of them knew it and neither of them was quite ready to say it out loud. "When I first rode in," he said, "I thought you were difficult." "I am difficult," she said. "You're not difficult," he said. "You're just 3 steps ahead of everybody around you, and when the people around you can't keep up they decide you're the problem." She was very still. "I was a teacher," he said. "I know what it looks like when someone is too smart for the room they're in," she said very carefully. "Marshal Morgan." "Theodore," he said. She absorbed this. "Theodore," she said. The saying of his name in that way, the first name, the real name, felt like stepping out onto a ledge you had been approaching for some time but had not been certain of until your foot was on it, and you felt it solid underneath you. "Esther," he said, and that was all he said, but the way he said it was the way the canyon said things, in the echo that answered after the original sound had already faded, full and resonant and carrying more than the original words. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not the kind of man who says things quickly or lightly, and I'm not saying anything tonight that needs to be said tonight. But I think you should know that when I leave here, it will not be the way I expected to leave when I arrived." She held that. "What did you expect?" she asked. "I expected to do my job and ride out," he said. "I did not expect to find someone who mapped a canyon for 2.5 years because she needed to understand the thing she was defending." He paused. "I did not expect to find someone who made me feel like I was moving slower than I should." "You're not slow," she said. "You're measured. There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "Slow people don't notice the ink feathering." He was quiet for a moment. Then that laugh again, the short, real one. And something in Esther Carver's sternum made a decision that her brain had not entirely approved yet, but was beginning to concede was probably inevitable. The crisis came 4 days later. It came in the form of a rider from Santa Fe, arriving at the ranch at full gallop in the mid-morning, carrying a message that Harlan Das had posted bond and was out, and that the messenger who had been carrying the federal documentation to Santa Fe had been intercepted on the road south of Springer. The documentation was gone. Das's lawyer, a man named Bertram Finch who operated out of Albuquerque, and who was very expensive and very effective, and had gotten 3 separate cases thrown out in the past 4 years on technicality grounds, had filed an emergency injunction in the territorial court that would nullify the investigation pending a review of the evidence, a review that could take up to 18 months. Unless the original documents, the originals from the vault that Esther had photographed in her memory but had replaced, could be presented to the federal commissioner directly within 72 hours. 72 hours to get from Cimarron to Santa Fe was possible with good horses on the main road. It was not possible if Das had men on the main road waiting. Theodore's face, when he read the message, was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when the person wearing them is calculating rapidly and does not want the calculation to be visible. "There's another route to Santa Fe," Esther said. He looked at her. "Through the canyon," she said. "The Southern Passage. It exits 6 miles north of Cimarron, but it runs 40 miles south-southwest before it exits on the mesa above the Mora Valley. From the mesa exit, you can reach the Las Vegas road in a day and a half. Santa Fe from Las Vegas is another hard day's ride. Total time is 60 hours in good conditions." 60 hours through a canyon you said has taken every life foolish enough to enter it unprepared, he said. 60 hours with me guiding, she said. I know every passage. I know where the water is. I know which crossings are safe in what conditions. The canyon will be dark after noon in the passages that run east-west, but I have been through those passages in total darkness, and I know them by touch. He looked at her for a long moment. How much of the canyon do you know well enough to navigate without light? He said, "All of it," she said. "All of it," he repeated. "I told you," she said, and there was nothing boastful in her voice, only the flat accuracy of a person stating a fact they have earned the right to state. 2.5 years. I was thorough. He was quiet, then he said, "We'll need to get the originals first." "Cullen is still in custody," she said. "The vault combination hasn't changed. Deputy Ortega will let us access the records room with proper authorization. You have proper authorization." "Yes," he said, "I do." They were back at the canyon mouth by mid-afternoon, with the original documents sealed in the waterproof map case that Esther kept in her saddle bag for exactly this kind of need. She had brought her rope, her compass, 2 days of food and water, a lantern with extra oil, her Navy Colt and 40 rounds, and the same quiet certainty she always carried into the canyon. The certainty of a person who has turned a landscape so thoroughly into knowledge that fear of it has been replaced by something more like respect. Theodore had his Winchester, his Colt, provisions, and the expression of a man who was doing something he would not have done on his own assessment of the situation, but who had made the calculation that the assessment that mattered here was not his. They entered the canyon. The first hour was the part Esther found simplest. The entrance passages that she had walked hundreds of times. The fork where the left-hand passage dead-ended. The flooding center passage that was safe today because there had been no rain on the mesa in 10 days, which she knew from observation, and from the dry white mineral deposits on the walls that accumulated only when the passage had been dry for at least a week. She moved through it with the fluid ease of someone walking their own home in the dark, and Theodore moved behind her with a focused, almost studious attention that she could feel on the back of her neck. He did not try to take point. He watched where she put her feet. He stopped when she raised her hand and moved when she dropped it. He asked questions only when they rested, good questions, specific questions, the questions of someone genuinely trying to build the same understanding she had rather than simply following a guide who happened to know the way. The flooding mechanism, he said, during a rest stop in a wide natural chamber where the ceiling opened up to a ribbon of sky 20 meters above. You said rain on the mesa above. How does the water travel? The passages are all below the water table. Some of them, she said. The flooding passages run along old fault lines. The rock is fractured in ways that aren't visible from inside. Water travels the fractures faster than it travels any visible channel. You can have a passage bone dry for weeks, and then a storm 2 mesas over sends water through the fractures and it rises from the floor, not from above. That's why people die. They see dry rock and think they're safe. He absorbed this. How did you learn to read the fault lines? A geologist came through Cimarron in 1878, she said. He was mapping mineral formations for a mining survey. He only stayed 2 weeks, but I followed him through every field site he visited and asked questions, until he either answered them or left to get away from me. He gave me his spare copy of Powell's report on the Colorado River drainage. She paused. I read it 4 times. Theodore was looking at her again with that expression, the one that had first appeared when she mentioned the vault combination, the one that she was beginning to understand meant that she had said something that moved the needle of his understanding of her further than he had expected. How many books do you have? He asked. In my room at the ranch house, she considered. 43, more in boxes in the storage room. My parents were both schoolteachers. She said this simply, without the defensiveness she sometimes wrapped around it when people asked, because with Theodore it did not seem to require defense. That explains the handwriting, he said. My mother said a person who could not write clearly could not think clearly, she said. Your mother was right, he said. The canyon deepened around them as they moved south. The passages that Esther had named for herself over years of mapping narrowed and narrowed again, and the quality of the light changed from warm gold to deep amber to the rich, concentrated ochre of late afternoon, in a place where the sun reached only in a narrow band at midday. The walls pressed close in some passages, and the sound changed, becoming intimate and almost interior, the way sound behaves in a room rather than in open air. Theodore spoke less in the narrow passages and more in the wide chambers. She noticed this and thought it was consistent with a man who was calibrating his inputs, processing more when there was more to process. They made camp on the 3rd hour in a chamber she privately called the library, because the stratified rock walls were layered in colors that always reminded her of the spines of books on a shelf, burnt orange and deep red and pale cream and dark brown, stacked in millennia rather than years, but carrying the same sense of accumulated information. They built a small fire from the dry juniper wood that gathered in drifts along the canyon floor, wood that the occasional flash floods deposited, and that dried in the arid canyon air to a density that burned clean and long. The fire was more for light than warmth, though the canyon air cooled rapidly after the sun left the rim above, and the warmth was not unwelcome. Theodore made coffee with a competence that suggested he had been making it over open fires for a long time, and Esther ate and checked the map case and verified their position against the compass bearing she had been tracking since they entered, and the numbers confirmed what her instincts had been telling her, that they were making good time, better than she had estimated, because the conditions were ideal. I want to tell you something, Theodore said, looking into the fire. She waited. The 7 years I spent teaching school in Missouri, he said, I was married. He let that sit for a moment. My wife died, fever in the winter of 1876. We had been married 3 years. I came west because staying was intolerable. Esther was quiet. I'm not telling you that as a dark past, he said, and his voice was careful and even, the voice of a man who had thought about how to say this before he said it. I'm telling you because I think you are the kind of person who prefers honesty to omission, and I would rather you know it now than find out later in a way that changes the shape of what I've said to you. She absorbed this. Her name, she asked. Clara, he said. She was kind. A pause. She would have liked you. She appreciated capable women. She was one herself. I'm sorry, Esther said, and meant it in the specific way she meant things, not as a formality but as a genuine acknowledgement of a genuine loss. It was 6 years ago, he said. I'm not broken by it, but it is part of the truth of me, and I am unwilling to have you forming a picture of my truth that doesn't include it. She looked at him across the fire. My truth, she said slowly, deciding as she spoke, is that I have been running this ranch in every practical sense for 4 years while my uncle dealt with the grief of losing my aunt, and that I have not once in those 4 years been credited publicly with what I was doing, and that I have been angrier about it than I have ever said out loud, and that the anger sometimes sits in me like the water in the fractured rock, present everywhere and invisible until the conditions are right. He watched her. I'm not telling you that as a complaint, she said, echoing his phrasing deliberately. I'm telling you because it is the shape of the person I actually am, including the parts that are not simple. Theodore Morgan looked at Esther Carver across a fire built at the bottom of a canyon that had claimed more lives than either of them wanted to think about, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen on a human face in a long time. The shape of the person you actually are, he said quietly, is the most extraordinary thing I have encountered in 32 years of living. She felt it through her entire body, the warmth of that, the terrifying, wonderful, absolutely inconvenient warmth. We have 40 miles still to go, she said, very carefully. I know, he said. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm just saying it so that it has been said. She looked at the fire. Thank you, she said simply. They slept in shifts. She took the first watch and he took the second, and when she woke to his hand on her shoulder at what her internal clock said was about 2 in the morning, she was aware for a moment of the simple, solid reality of him sitting nearby in the dark, breathing steadily, keeping watch over her sleep in the bottom of a canyon that most people in the world would have been terrified to enter. Something about that felt like the answer to a question she had been asking for a long time without quite knowing the question. They broke camp in the dark and moved again by lantern light through the passages Esther knew so well that she could have navigated them blind, and in the east-west passage she had mentioned to Theodore, the one that ran in total darkness even at noon because the canyon walls leaned toward each other above. She did navigate it with the lantern shuttered, her hands on the walls, her feet reading the texture of the floor the way hands read a printed page, and Theodore followed her with his hand on her shoulder. Connected to her navigation by that single point of contact, trusting her completely, that was the moment. She felt it, not a dramatic moment. Not thunder or lightning or anything the dime novels would have recognized. Just his hand on her shoulder in the dark, following her lead without hesitation, in a place where most men would have been too frightened and too proud to acknowledge their fear, and the absolute, undiluted trust in that contact doing something to the last wall she had built around the part of herself she had decided was too inconvenient for anyone to want. The wall came down. It came down quietly and completely, and she kept moving through the dark passage as though nothing had happened, but everything had happened, and she suspected from the quality of the silence behind her that Theodore Morgan knew it too. They emerged from the eastern passage into the dim pre-dawn gray of a section of canyon so deep that even sunrise would not reach the floor for another 2 hours, and Esther opened the lantern and checked her compass and found them exactly where she had expected them to be. 12 miles to the mesa exit, she said. 12 miles, he repeated. Less than 4 hours, she said. He looked at her, and in the lantern light his face was tired and dust-covered and entirely, magnificently real. After the mesa exit, he said, we ride to Las Vegas. Yes, she said. And from Las Vegas to Santa Fe, he said. Yes. And after Santa Fe, he said, what does Esther Carver do? She looked at him for a long moment. Esther Carver, she said, carefully feeling the words as she chose them, has spent 7 years doing what needed to be done for other people. After Santa Fe, I think Esther Carver might decide what she wants to do for herself. And what does she want? He said. The lantern flame moved slightly in the canyon draft. To stop being 3 steps ahead in an empty room, she said. To be 3 steps ahead in the company of someone who can see where the steps are going. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very deliberately, he reached out and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not sweeping or theatrical. Just the deliberate, considered taking of her hand. The way a man takes something he has decided he wants to be responsible for, with the specific gravity of intention. She let him. They stood like that for a moment in the lantern light at the bottom of the canyon, the rock walls rising around them in their ancient colors, and then Esther Carver, who was not a woman given to gestures she had not thought through, turned her hand over and held his back. The last 12 miles of the canyon were the hardest. Not because the terrain was more dangerous, it was actually easier, the southern passages being wider and better lit as they climbed toward the mesa exit, but because they were moving fast and the pace was demanding, and the hours before dawn were the cold, bone-tired hours that required the kind of determination that could not be performed, only felt. They spoke less, conserved breath, moved with the efficient purpose of people who had a deadline they intended to meet. The mesa exit was a slot passage that opened, quite suddenly, and with the theatrical abruptness of a curtain being pulled aside, onto the flat, pale, wind-struck expanse of the mesa above the Mora Valley. The sky above it was huge and beginning to lighten in the east, the first thin line of rose appearing above the Sangre de Cristos, and the cold, clean air of the mesa after the close air of the canyon hit Esther's face like water. They had made it in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Her horse was waiting, and so was Theodore's. They had hobbled the horses at the eastern entrance to the canyon the previous morning, and the animals had grazed through the night on the sparse mesa grass with the philosophical patience of well-trained frontier horses. Theodore looked at Esther across the saddles as they prepared to mount. "You are," he said, with the same simple gravity he had used to take her hand, "the most remarkable person I have ever known." She thought about deflecting. She was practiced at deflecting. She had years of deflection behind her. Instead she said, "I know." And then, because the look on his face when she said it was worth seeing, she smiled at him, fully and without reservation, for what she thought might be the first time in weeks. He looked at her smile with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has been maintaining composure through several days of extraordinary circumstances, and has just encountered the thing that made the composure more difficult than usual. They rode south. They reached the Las Vegas road by late afternoon, pushed through the night on the good flat road with fresh horses purchased at the way station outside Mora, and rode into Santa Fe with the morning sun already hot on their backs, and the original documents sealed in their waterproof case, and 31 hours to spare before the injunction hearing. The federal land commissioner's name was Augustus Webb. He was a compact, precise man with spectacles, and the manner of someone who had seen enough frontier fraud cases to be past surprise but not past anger. He saw them within 2 hours of their arrival. He examined the documents for a long time. He asked questions that were surgical in their precision, and Esther answered them with the same precision, cross-referencing against her field notes, explaining the surveying methodology, demonstrating how the altered records differed from the originals in ways that her 3 months of careful observation had allowed her to document comprehensively. At one point, Webb looked up from the documents and looked at Esther over his spectacles. "Who prepared this survey analysis?" he said. "I did," she said. "You're the ranch hand," he said. "I am," she said. Webb looked at Theodore. Theodore said nothing, but his expression said, "Yes, I know." Webb looked back at Esther. "The analysis is excellent," he said. "Graduate-level cartography and land law application. Where did you study?" "Colfax County, New Mexico Territory," she said. "And the books I could get." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to the documents, and when he looked up again his expression had the hard, forward-facing quality of a man who had made a decision. The injunction was denied that afternoon. The federal review of all affected land claims was placed under direct federal supervision. Harlan Dass's land acquisition activities were referred to the federal grand jury. Reeve Cullen's land office records were frozen pending a full audit. The families whose claims had been corrupted would receive notice within the week. Esther sat in the hallway of the commissioner's building afterward and felt the particular emptiness that follows the completion of something that has occupied every available space in your mind for months. A strange, echoing clarity, the feeling of a room that has been full of furniture and is now bare and full of light and waiting to be filled with something chosen rather than something necessary. Theodore came and sat beside her. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. They were quiet. "I need to send a report to the district office," he said. "It will take 2 days to write properly." "I need to send a letter to my uncle," she said, "and another one to Deputy Ortega." 2 days in Santa Fe," he said. She looked at him. 2 days in Santa Fe," she agreed. They had dinner that evening at a restaurant on the plaza, an actual restaurant with cloth on the tables and a menu and a woman who played guitar in the corner. And it was the most civilized thing Esther had done in months, and the company made it feel like the beginning of something rather than an interruption of the ordinary. They talked for 3 hours, not about the case, about everything else. About the books she had read and the books he had read and the overlap between them, which was considerable and which delighted her. About the Missouri school where he had taught and the particular student he had never forgotten, a girl who had memorized the entire Kentucky geology survey because she wanted to find out where the good well sites were, and her father couldn't afford a proper surveyor. About what Esther thought the canyon looked like from directly above, viewed from some impossible vantage, and whether she had ever tried to sketch it, which she had in her notebooks over and over, trying to compress the 3-dimensional labyrinth into 2-dimensional lines, and how she had eventually abandoned the attempt and accepted that the canyon required a language that flat paper could not hold. About his mother, who had been a reader. About her parents, who had been teachers. About the particular grief of losing people who gave you the shape of your mind, and then were gone before you could thank them properly for it. About the future in the careful, unrushed way that 2 people discuss the future when they are both serious people who are not in a hurry but who can see, with the clear-eyed perception that both of them possessed, that the future they are discussing is almost certainly going to intersect in some significant way. On the second night, walking back across the plaza after dinner, the air warm and carrying the smell of wood smoke and the distant desert, Theodore stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her. "I know we have not known each other long," he said. "I know the circumstances have been extreme, which makes everything feel more immediate than it might otherwise. I know you are a woman who thinks carefully and doesn't make fast decisions. All of that is true," she said. "I am not asking for a fast decision," he said. "I am asking whether the conversation we have been having, the longer one, is a conversation you want to continue." She looked at him. The plaza was quiet around them, the stars above Santa Fe coming out in their unhurried thousands the way they did above the high desert, extravagant and impersonal and entirely indifferent to the specific human conversations happening beneath them, which somehow made those conversations feel both small and very important at once. "Theodore," she said, "the conversation we have been having is the first one in my adult life that I have not wanted to end." The thing that happened to his face then was something she knew she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. He took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was startling in a man of his build and his occupation, and he kissed her, once carefully, in the manner of a man who is doing something he intends to do many more times and wants the first time to be exactly right. She kissed him back, and the warmth that had been sitting in her sternum since the first evening on the canyon rim, stubborn and inconvenient and entirely inevitable, spread through her completely. They were married in Cimarron in October of 1882, 6 weeks after returning from Santa Fe. The ceremony was small, because neither of them had patience for ceremony, but it was real, witnessed by Benjamin Carver and Deputy Ortega, and the woman who played guitar at the Santa Fe restaurant and whom Esther had written to. On an impulse she did not entirely examine, because she had wanted someone at her wedding who had witnessed the beginning of the thing, even if the witness had not known at the time what she was witnessing. Benjamin Carver wept, which surprised everyone including himself. Esther wore her good dress, dark blue wool with ivory buttons, and her hair down, which she almost never wore it, and Theodore Morgan looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he had not known he needed until he found it and cannot now imagine having been without it. The ranch changed after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a place changes when the person who has been holding it together in secret is finally seen and credited, and that visibility allows the work to become something shared rather than something carried alone. Theodore resigned his marshal's commission in the spring of 1883, not reluctantly. He had given it a great deal of thought and had concluded, with the deliberate honesty that was one of the things Esther loved most about him, that the life of a federal marshal was the life he had built to survive grief rather than to build anything else, and that he was no longer in the business of surviving, he was in the business of building. He became, instead, the ranch's operational manager, working alongside Esther in the specific and effective partnership that their first 10 days together had demonstrated was possible. They made decisions together. They had arguments, real ones, the kind that two intelligent and strong-willed people who have genuine respect for each other have, about breeding stock and water rights, and the best approach to the new county land registry that was established after the federal audit, and which Esther had been appointed to help design, the first woman appointed to any county administrative body in Colfax County's history, which caused some controversy that neither she nor Theodore paid any attention to because they were too busy doing the actual work. The federal review of the land claims took 8 months and resulted in 4 homesteading families being restored to their properties and Harlan Das being convicted of conspiracy to commit land fraud and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial penitentiary. Reeve Cullen received 3 years. Hank Delaney, who had provided extensive testimony in exchange for leniency, received a fine and a suspended sentence and left Colfax County and was not heard from again. The Carver Ranch survived and expanded, not through the aggressive acquisition of neighboring land, but through the gradual improvement of its own operations, better water management, better breeding, better record-keeping, which Esther systematized in a set of ledgers so well organized that the County Agricultural Extension Office asked to use them as a model, which she agreed to on the condition that they were credited to the Carver Morgan Ranch, the first use of the hyphenated name that would become, over the following years, well known in the territory. Benjamin Carver's health declined slowly through 1883 and 1884, and Esther tended to him with the same thorough attention she brought to everything. And when he passed quietly in the January of 1885 with his niece's hand in his and his most recent copy of the county newspaper, open to the article about the expanded land registry, the last thing he said to her was that her parents would have been enormously proud. Which was the right thing to say and which she carried with her afterward as carefully as she had carried anything. She cried for 3 days. Then she got up and went back to work. She and Theodore did not speak much about the grief while it was fresh. They did not need to. He sat with her when she needed sitting with, worked alongside her when she needed work, left her to her long walks on the canyon rim when she needed solitude, and was there when she came back, consistent and solid and entirely reliable, which was exactly what grief required and exactly what she had never expected to have. The spring of 1885 brought new growth and a new fact. The new fact arrived on a Tuesday morning when Esther sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and looked at the numbers she was doing in her head and said, with the same direct honesty she applied to all factual assessments, "Theodore, I believe we are going to have a child." Theodore Morgan's face did the thing she had first seen in the council room of the canyon, the thing that she could now name clearly. It was the face of a man who is receiving more than he expected and does not know exactly what to do with his own joy. He sat down. He took both her hands. He said very quietly, "Are you all right?" "I'm quite well," she said. "I'm surprised, though I suppose I shouldn't be entirely surprised by the predictable results of ordinary events." He laughed. "The real one." "No," he said, "I suppose not." Their son was born in November of 1885, healthy and loud, and possessed from his first month of a particular focused gaze that made old women in town say he would be a thinker, which Esther noted with private satisfaction. They named him James, after Esther's father, with Benjamin as a middle name, after her uncle. Theodore said nothing when she proposed the names except that they were right, and they were. James Morgan grew up on the canyon's edge. He grew up watching his mother read the land the way other children watched their mothers do ordinary things. He grew up listening to her explain why the water moved through the rock the way it did, and what the strata told you about the history of a place, and asking questions that made his father laugh and his mother's eyes light up with the specific pleasure of a person who has waited a long time for the right person to ask the right questions. Theodore taught him to ride and to shoot and to track and to read handwriting. Esther taught him to survey and to read maps and to distinguish the kind of silence that meant nothing was there from the kind that meant something was there and was waiting. She also taught him to make coffee, on the theory that a person who could not perform basic civilized acts in remote places was a person unnecessarily at the mercy of circumstances, which was not a state either of them intended to tolerate. In the spring of 1888, they had a second child, a girl this time whom they named Clara, and who turned out to have her father's brown eyes and her mother's relentless focus, a combination that Theodore said was either the best possible outcome or the most alarming one, and Esther said it was both, and she was right, which she often was, which Theodore never tired of, which was one of the things she loved about him most of all. The canyon remained. It was always there, on the eastern edge of the ranch, present and unchanged in the way that geological time is unchanged by human generations, running its dark and secret passages through the red rock, the way it had for 10,000 years before any of them arrived, and would for 10,000 years after all of them were gone. Esther walked its rim in the evenings for the rest of her life, and sometimes she descended with her rope and her compass and her notebooks to check on passages she had not visited in a season, to verify that the things she knew still matched the things that were. Theodore went with her sometimes. He never led. He followed her into the canyon the same way he had the first time, watching her hands and her feet, reading her pauses, stopping when she stopped. He had learned enough in the years of accompanying her that he could navigate the outer passages alone if he had to. But he never had to, and he never wanted to. And not because he needed her to navigate for him, but because following her into the canyon was one of the specific pleasures of his life. The pleasure of watching someone in complete command of a thing they loved. The pleasure of being trusted with the close observation of genius at work. He told her this once on a warm October evening in 1889, when James was 3 and Clara was 1, and the ranch was settled in its fall routines, and the canyon below them was catching the last light in its deepest reds and golds. He said, "I have been thinking about what it means to be the kind of person who follows someone else's lead." She looked at him, and, "I spent a long time," he said, "thinking that following meant diminishing. That the leader's skill reflected on the follower as a lack. That is a very common error," she said. "I know," he said, "I was wrong." "Also common," she said, smiling at him. "Following you," he said, "has been the most instructive, the most interesting, and the most humbling experience of my life. Not because you show me my limitations, because you show me what a person can become when they take their own ability seriously and do not apologize for it." She was quiet for a moment. "You showed me that too," she said. "The fact that you followed, not the fact that you needed to. The fact that you did it without apology and without resentment and with genuine attention. I have never in my life had that from anyone else." He looked at her. "You have had it from me," he said, "since the first time you told me where the echo answered with lies." She laughed at that, the real laugh, the unguarded one, and he loved the sound of it the way he had loved it from the first time he heard it in the council room at the bottom of the canyon, short and genuine, and carrying inside it the particular joy of a person who does not laugh easily, and therefore means it completely when they do. He put his arm around her on the canyon rim. She leaned against his shoulder. Below them, the canyon moved into its evening shade, passage by passage, the hidden paths going dark in sequence from east to west, as they always did, as they had always done, as they would continue to do long after any human voice had memorized their names. But for now, on this evening, in this October of 1889, the person who knew every one of those paths sat on the rim with the person who had trusted her to lead him through them, and they were warm, and they were home, and the map of the country between them was the most honest one either of them had ever drawn. The years moved as years do. James Morgan grew to be exactly what his focused early gaze had promised, a man of methodical intelligence and genuine warmth, who at 20 years old would ride the canyon route his mother had mapped with confidence born from years of her patient instruction, carrying the survey work forward into the new century, with the specific pride of a person who understands not just what they are doing, but why it matters. Clara Morgan would become, by a trajectory so logical it felt inevitable in retrospect, the first woman formally hired by the New Mexico Territorial Land Office in 1905, hired specifically because she had grown up doing exactly the kind of work the office needed and doing it demonstrably better than the men applying for the same position, which created the same controversy that her mother's appointment to the county land registry had created 20 years earlier, and which she handled with the same focused indifference to the controversy that had always been the Carver-Morgan approach to obstacles that were rooted in stupidity rather than logic. Esther finished her comprehensive canyon survey in 1892, a bound volume of 143 pages with hand-drawn maps and elevation profiles and geological annotations, which she submitted to the United States Geological Survey in Washington, where it was received with considerable interest by a surveyor named Marcus Hall, who wrote to her 3 times with follow-up questions, and eventually cited her work in a paper on fractured rock hydraulics that was published in 1896, and which Esther read aloud to Theodore on a winter evening with the fire going and James asleep in the next room, and Clara in the process of becoming a person, the paper addressing her by name and credentials in a way that made Theodore reach across the kitchen table and take her hand. She had not cried when it arrived. She had been very, very still for a moment, and then she had said, to no one in particular and to Theodore specifically, "Well, there it is." And Theodore had said, "There it is." And they had sat with it together for a while, the accumulated weight of 7 years of early mornings and cold descents and meticulous notation, the thing she had built in the margins of everything else she was building, recognized now in the formal language of her field, her name in print in a publication that existed 2,000 miles away in a world that had mostly not known she existed. She was 33 years old. She had a great deal more to do. The canyon was always there, and Theodore Morgan was always beside her when she went to its edge, looking out at the thing she knew better than anyone alive, the thing that had very nearly taken him from her before she had found him, the thing that had been the medium through which they had first understood what they could be to each other. One evening in the summer of 1896, when James was 10 and Clara was 7, and the ranch had just had its best cattle year since Theodore had taken over the breeding program, and the evening air was warm and smelling of sage and summer grass, Esther stood on the canyon rim and said, quietly to the canyon itself, and to Theodore and to no one in particular, "I think we have made something good here." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "I know we have," he said. She turned to look at him. The sun was going down behind the mountains in its summer extravagance, the sky doing the thing it did in July that always made her think the world was showing off. And Theodore Morgan's face in that light was 36 years old and weathered and entirely familiar, and the sight of it did something to her that distance and years and difficulty had not diminished by even the smallest amount. "I was thinking of the ranch," she said. "I know you were," he said. "I was thinking of something larger." She took his hand, he held it. Below them, the canyon moved through its evening shades, unhurried and absolute, the hidden paths going dark one by one in the way they always had, the echo chambers and the false floors and the flooding passages and the blind man's garden, and the place where the echo answered with lies, all of it moving through its evening exactly as it had moved through 1,000 evenings before, and would move through 1,000 evenings after. And at the canyon's edge, in the last light of a July evening in 1896, Esther Carver and Theodore Morgan stood together in the complete and particular peace of two people who have found, in each other and in the country they have made between them, exactly what they were built for, and who know it, and who hold it with both hands. The canyon breathed below them. The stars came out above. And the paths that had been hidden were hidden no longer, known now by name and by heart and by the particular memory of a woman who had walked every one of them, and who would, for the rest of her remarkable life, continue to walk them in the company of a man who had been lost and been found, and who had never, not once, been too proud to follow when she led the way home.